Good morning, Catalina Foothills Church and friends. It's Pastor John Stone with our Tuesday morning devotion. And we are in Romans chapter 2. And in Romans chapter 2, Paul is further explaining why the judgment of God against mankind, said another way, why the wrath of God is being displayed against mankind, why that's deserved. Paul, in one sense, beginning in chapter 1 and verse 18, going all the way through chapter 3 and verse 9, is justifying or teaching why God is right to be angry with humans. And he's taking on different arguments. And in chapter 2, he's going to talk about how we condemn others at the very thing we do, and how those without the law also do the things that are righteous, even though they've never been taught the law. So let me just read just a few, to begin with a few verses in chapter 2. You therefore have no excuse, you who pass judgment on someone else. For at whatever point you judge another, you are condemning yourself, because you who pass judgment do the same things. Now we know that God's judgment against those who do such thing is based on truth. So when you, a mere human being, pass judgment on them, and yet do the same things, do you think you will escape God's judgment? Or do you show contempt for the riches of his kindness, forbearance, and patience, not realizing that God's kindness is intended to lead you to repentance? So, good night. Romans is amazing. There is a lot here. So let me just say a couple of things in our devotion this morning. And Paul's addressing all of mankind. So clearly in this first part of Romans 2, and we may look at a good bit more of the chapter this coming Sunday, but clearly in the first part, he's saying, be careful. Your heart is broken. That's his assumption. He'll justify that later, but your heart is broken, and wherever you tend to judge people, that's where you fail also. He's saying you judge others, and in your judgment, you're judging yourself, because when you say, hey, stop being greedy, stop gossiping, stop coveting, you turn around and you're greedy, you covet, you gossip. That your heart is broken in such a way that even where you pass a judgment on someone, it may be correct, you're wrong. You do the same things you judge others about. So God's wrath is justified because you, as a judgment maker, you're doing the same things. You're guilty because you do this. And then he says, well, and some of them may say, but like God's never judged me. Why would I think that my judgment's wrong? He says in verse 4, and this is powerful, or do you show contempt for the riches of his kindness, forbearance, and patience, not realizing that God's kindness is intended to lead you to repentance? Man, this is going to be powerful to preach and hard to preach, and a beautiful way to preach. But he's saying here, you may not have felt God's judgment, even though in chapter 2 we saw he described it really well as a macro sensation, that we are turned over to what we want. The reason you may not have felt God's judgment personally is that he is patient with you. Don't show contempt for his kindness, forbearance, and patience, not realizing that God's kindness is intended to lead you to repentance. But he goes on here in the rest of chapter 2, and I don't have time to read it, to say, but be sure of this. You may not have personally felt or been able to detect God's judgment, but he says, this is how he says it, in verse 8, but for those who are self-seeking and who reject the truth and follow evil, there will be wrath and anger. There will be trouble and distress for every human being who does evil, first for the Jew and then for the Gentile. Paul assures us that while many of us may not believe his own analysis in chapter 1 about God's wrath and judgment, that all of us indeed will stand before the judgment seat of Christ, and a judgment will be rendered against us. And his point is, you cannot stand in that judgment. And one of the ways you know that you cannot stand in that judgment, all of us, including me, is that we're hypocrites. And I can just say personally, the places where I have the least patience with people are the places where I'm the weakest. It is confounding to my soul that the place where I'm loudest, maybe just inside or in my head, and I'm so on people, when I really look at it, are the places I'm failing. Probably, honestly, I'm judging them out of a sense of my own shame. Man, I understand why pastors take 4 years to preach through Romans. We could preach 2 sermons in Romans 2, 1 through 4. We probably won't do that, but just powerful stuff here. Look forward to being you on Sunday. Look at your own heart. And before you pass judgment on someone else, be careful. Are you judging them at the very place where you too will fail and face the judgment of God? Great to be with you. Have a great week. Look forward to seeing you soon.